The Open University of Hong Kong recently held an international conference on open and innovative education. In the following keynote address, Professor Dragan Gašević, Professor of Learning Analytics and co-director of the Education Futures Research Center in the Faculty of Education at Monash University, discusses the key challenges that affect the implementation of learning analytics. He describes some examples of the successful use of learning analytics in higher education, and then overviews an approach to developing institutional policy and strategies for learning analytics implementation in higher education.
So today I'm going to talk about the complexity of the issues of adoption of learning analytics and the ways how we can develop different types of policies that are surrounding higher education primarily. That's basically where most of my work is happening, and I'd say also most of the work in the field of learning analytics is happening. And to the point that we are now reaching that with respect to learning analytics is becoming a question in some of the institutions around the world, is that whether learning analytics policy is something which is called also in general policy era wicked problem. And wicked problems are those types of problems that are fairly complex, and that are also having some unintended consequences. So you introduce something, but then there are different unintended consequences. Also, there's lots of pushback as well to do something. So I'm going to start first in terms of the current state of learning analytics. In the early days of learning analytics, everybody was excited, oh, we can easily put together some sources of data. Those sources of data can easily be combined to predict student retention. And then lots of these different types of deficit models were eventually built in terms of identification of students being at risk of failing a course, and then building on top of that early warning systems. And that's fine. In some of the cases as well, we saw that we are getting some of the good results. However, the field moved on. And what we are seeing more in the recent years is much more focus on the ways how we can describe and predict learning outcomes and processes. How we can also understand better and predict, in many cases, dispositions of students or 21st century skills, such as critical thinking, collaborative problem solving, or information seeking. In some other cases as well, and we are seeing in that area probably the biggest progress, and that's basically understanding of feedback and the ways how we can scale up feedback so that we can maximize students' outcomes and also increase their experience. But in other cases as well, we are seeing a lots of focus as well in the development of different frameworks that are supporting privacy protection and ethical use of analytics. While all these areas are generating lots of excitement, at least in the levels of higher education, senior levels, they are still actually suggesting one common thing, that first of all, the reason for adoption of the learning analytics is really kind of important because we need to recognize that learning analytics is about learning. And when we are saying that learning analytics is about learning, is we need to basically say that learning analytics is not just a technical area where we are talking about data science. It is equally about the theory or the ways how we are conceptualizing learning, how we are conceptualizing teaching and education, as well as design. And we are talking about design, first of all, the way how analytics is communicated back to the learners, and the ways as well how analytics is incorporated into our educational, instructional, or learning designs. And of course, we need to think a lot about the methods, how we are evaluating the effects of analytics. While the field of learning analytics is maturing, what we are seeing, and this is the slide that I've been using, unfortunately, for the last 5 years, that many institutions, they have lots of interest, but they're telling us, well, we're in early days of learning analytics adoption. And the question is why we are stuck at this level of early adoption. I'm going to talk about some of these adoption challenges now, and that's the kind of work that we've been doing for the last 4 years. Initially in Australia, we had a project funded by the Australian Office for Learning and Teaching, and now I have a European project which is also looking into the issues and the ways how we can support higher education institutions in implementation of learning analytics. As part of that process, we documented and studied the literature and also collected our own data. One of these key challenges in many cases is the shortage of the leadership for the ways how learning analytics can be implemented. While many senior leaders are quite excited about learning analytics, they don't really quite understand, nor do they have sufficient background how to implement learning analytics. So for example, I have some connections with some of the industries as well in the field based in, for example, US, and they are saying there's huge commercial interest, but they are also feeling a bit kind of uncomfortable to sell them like snake's oil, simply because they don't really even understand to formalize the types of questions and the potential value. Yet many senior leaders feel the pressure that they need to adopt learning analytics. And then in many cases, even if they decide to implement learning analytics, what we are documenting is that there is no equal engagement of all the relevant stakeholders. And when we are talking about these relevant stakeholders, we want to primarily engage who are at the forefront. And I'm thinking about teaching staff and students. They are barely engaged in many institutions. The process works in the following way. We buy a product, and some senior leaders think, well, we bought this product. What's else to do with learning analytics? Therefore, we need to have this problem of engagement of relevant stakeholders also accounted for. Then, in many cases, just buying a product or even having many initiatives is perhaps not enough. Skills are the other area where many institutions are struggling. Organizational, for example, relevant professional development opportunities for academic staff, or for students as well, the ways how learning analytics or general data science skills can be advanced is a bit of a challenge. In many cases as well, these type of skills are also not even distributed across relevant groups that are responsible for learning analytics implementation. Many cases, academic leadership is very essential if you want to make a difference and be able to convince the rest of the university in the ways how analytics can be effectively implemented, in addition to the important role that the professional staff groups are playing. And then there's another challenge which we all know so well, and that's the basically culture of the institutions to make decisions based on data. Shane Dawson and Leah McFadden in 2012 documented a case study of a Canadian university who was trying to make a decision about the use of their LMS, and they were thinking what else to do in the future. They had a presentation of the results of the analytics team about the way how their LMS was used. That was noted down in the minutes of one of the meetings, and that was it. There was nothing else that actually was used to inform the future decision. Most of the decisions were primarily around the technical issues and the ease of migration. And then, in terms of policies, many institutions, in particular in Europe, are actually, but around the world as well, because they are affected with that as well, quite actually concerned about the ways how GDPR or this general data protection regulation is going to affect them. So what does it mean, like informed consent? When students are consenting, is it enough to just ask them when they are enrolling the programs? And then there are plenty of ethical issues with respect to the ways how we are presenting information, who owns data, what is the data governance, what is the ways how we are actually really making less harm to our students by doing some of these cool analytics. So as you can see, I mean, we all have the reasons to think that perhaps learning analytics is maybe this wicked problem that is really hard and we cannot solve. And the question is how we can potentially start building that institutional capacity and address some of these challenges. Now that I told you all the potential weaknesses of the work that I'm doing, you might be wondering why am I doing it at all, because we have so many problems. But I think there are potential directions and the ways how these issues can be done. I'm going to talk about these directions. I'm primarily be focusing on the European project that we are coordinating that is ending in September this year. And inside of this project, we started from the idea that while we are all excited about the availability of data, and obviously exploiting these data with lots of different algorithms, well, look, I'm the one who has the computer science background and love to play with different types of algorithms and develop new ones. The question of these algorithmic issues is not enough when we are talking about analytics. And I'd say it's not enough when we are talking about any technology in higher education or the entire educational sector. What we want to basically achieve in this project, we want to create an umbrella, which is a framework that can help us address the concerns of a multitude of stakeholders that we have inside of our institution. And that umbrella pretty much means that some stakeholders may have a focus and the intended benefits that are related to personalization and adaptivity. In other cases, Other stakeholders are really equally concerned with privacy and ethics. Other stakeholders are more interested into kind of a mobility or portability of data. In Europe, that's quite actually important because many students have this Erasmus year. They can actually go to other universities. Why would they have this cold start problem when they move to another institution if they are getting potentially some personalization? And plenty of the other issues related to informed consent. So our idea with the project was, well, can we start from something that is more tangible, that can be used, and that it has been used in the literature, that it is translating empirical or scientific evidence into a policy. And what we did is basically we started from something that was suggested initially by Leah McFadden, who led a paper he wrote in Assessment, Research and Practice journal a few years ago, and then Rebecca Ferguson as well equally suggested similar approach from the Open University. And they were basically suggesting the use of this ROMA framework, which stands for Rapid Outcome Mapping approach. And this rapid outcome mapping approach requires initially clear definition of the intended policy and the strategy that the institution or a particular policy should serve. Then the other critical thing there is then to go through, in their case, they were suggesting 6 steps in the original framework. And that framework assumes that we need to first of all understand the political context in which we are trying to implement certain change. We also need to identify relevant stakeholders. We also need to then identify what is that desired behavioral change or the purpose in our case of learning analytics. Then equally so, we need to define our engagement strategy and think about the ways how we can then engage relevant stakeholders to start changing the ways how they are doing some of the things and incorporate some of the innovation that we have. Then we also need to think about the way, what is our capacity inside an institution? And then final thing is to have the monitoring and organizational learning developed. This was actually the steps that we initially kind of hypothesized inside of the project. I'm going to walk you through all these steps as the outcomes of some of the critical findings that we have. But what we did inside of the project, we basically have a very thorough methodology. We initially started from a systematic lit review, as well as the reviews of the existing policies, institutional, and codes of practice. We published, obviously, some of that, and I already mentioned even some of these critical results that we identified as part of that. Then we decided to engage relevant stakeholder groups. For students and academic staff, we created and validated instruments that are measuring their expectations from learning analytics. In addition to that, we also had the protocols and conducted focus groups. Both of these data collection points with academic staff and students happened in 5 different European countries. In addition to that, we also then engaged senior leaders of different institutions. We had about 75 interviews with senior management in higher education across about 50 different institutions. In addition to that, we also distributed a survey, institutional survey, in collaboration with the European University Association with about 50 plus institutions who responded to our survey. We distributed to about 250 institutions who previously responded to their e-learning survey. And in addition to that, we also organized a number of events, different types of workshops that were regional, national, and then exactly a month ago, we had a kind of major Sheila conference in Brussels where we had also even several government ministers who gave keynote address in that process. So we get basically fairly kind of inclusive approach to generate new evidence and the ways how learning analytics can be implemented in higher education. Our final product is this. So we changed the Roma framework and we basically kind of realized that we cannot think about these 6 key steps as the sequential steps that are happening one after another, but rather there are actually 6 key dimensions. And they are quite important for us, but it is also important to recognize that some of these dimensions are actually, and the activities related within these dimensions are occurring about the same time or in parallel. That's really one key thing. In addition to that, what we have with the Sheila framework is that we identify 3 key elements that are underlying each of these 6 dimensions. And these 3 elements mean what are those critical action points that need to be taken by institutions that we documented across the board? What are the critical challenges that we also identified across these different institutions and based on the available evidence that we collected? And then final critical thing is what are those relevant policy questions? So you can actually think of this framework as the following. We have now a fairly large kind of a knowledge base where, for example, when we are talking about the political context, one of the key kind of action point is to identify internal and external drivers for learning analytics. I'm going to unpack that a little in a short bit. And then with respect to the relevant policy questions as well, that, what are those basically expectations that are the reasons for learning analytics adoption that can be happening inside an institution? And then with respect to challenges, assuming that learning analytics is a silver bullet, or it will solve magically all your problems is not really something that we can expect. So that's basically what framework kind of in a nutshell looks like. But in kind of reality, we also have this kind of a fairly extensive document that provides a description of all these relevant challenges. This document will be publicly available in September, but I'm happy to share it if you are interested, because I think we have now the final version with all the relevant stakeholder evidence incorporated. So what we are basically also doing as part of this process, we are basically now implementing 4 institutional policies and strategies for learning analytics. I'm going to explain some of that process as well and some of the experiences as I'm going through that. But now I'm going to actually walk you through the framework and go to the kind of bottom of it, or give you some at least insights that we found out as we were going through our journey in the creation of the Sheila framework. So I'm going to basically use our framework, and I'm going to walk us through these 6 dimensions and then try to give you some of the insights. So with respect to the mapping of the political context, it is really very essential for institutions to think about what are those drivers that are motivating them to implement learning analytics. In many cases, institutions have internally, and what we documented, needs to really improve their learning and teaching. They want to improve the quality of their learning designs. Or in some other institutions, but that's not the norm for all the institutions, they want to also improve retention of students. And those are in many cases fairly internal reasons why they are doing learning analytics. But externally, what we are seeing is, for example, in the UK, it's a big trend with the teaching excellence framework. Institutions want to improve their rating. That's a pretty powerful, actually, external reason why institutions are doing that. And I can tell that now that I'm in Australia as well. Many institutions are actually quite concerned with that. And I think I'm not justifying the need for that, and I'm not going to actually debating whether it's good to just think about improvement of student satisfaction as the primary purpose, what we need to do. That's pretty controversial, but it's something that is driving the policy and the reasons why learning analytics are being adopted. Some other institutions are really kind of feeling a pressure that they will lose the ground and they need to implement learning analytics. And this is a first-hand experience that I had as well with learning analytics. Not that our institutions felt that they had to actually implement learning analytics, but it's also in terms of the environment in which many institutions are operating. We can see that we are living now the second hype of the artificial intelligence. The previous hype was sometimes in the 80s. When I was actually to start to do my PhD, although I can now loudly say that I did it in something which is artificial intelligence, everybody was trying to hide it under the carpet. Now, I'm not really doing artificial intelligence. Because last time, again, we managed to kind of overpromise and under-deliver with respect to those promises, although there were many great things that were produced even in the previous hype of learning analytics. So today we are seeing a basically hype of neural networks or deep learning. And what we are basically seeing is everybody is telling you, well, just give us data and you'll get all the answers. Last year, senior vice principal at Edinburgh asked me, can I have a phone call with this new learning analytics organization in the UK? They are also selling their new product. And we started a conversation, and they asked me about Edinburgh, what are the priorities? I told them, well, retention is not. We have 94% student retention, and so we are not really interested in that. And then they spent first half an hour again talking about student retention. once we basically kind of concluded that's not of interest for us, then the next question was, okay, what else can you do? And they were, yeah, we can do all sorts of other things. And the whole conversation was about trying to sell the neural networks. But what precisely, they didn't have any answers to give. And that's something that many institutions are actually feeling a pressure to be engaged into. However, they are really going to buy just snake oil. And that's really very important to consider. But then what we also found in some institutions that are actually understanding that analytics requires resourcing. And analytics has plenty of the implications on relevant stakeholder groups. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But they also then realize, why don't we have learning analytics together with some other important projects? Some institutions have projects that are supporting student success. Other cases, what we also found is that institutions are doing that with the implementation of the new learning management system, because they can actually do something that can be set up properly in that process. In other cases as well, institutions are aligning that with some of the external frameworks that they have, for example, for quality enhancement. And it is quite an essential, I think, approach to the success of learning analytics, not to consider it as a side project, as a thing on its own, but rather something that is heavily intertwined with other things that we have inside of our institutions. Obviously, the framework has plenty of the things, so I'm not going to be able to say everything that we have inside the framework, but this is really just a kind of a surface level. So with respect to the stakeholders, we need to identify them, and that's quite essential, but it is really critical if you want to have a success in learning analytics at an institutional level, even if that institutional level is just basically several relevant programs. That process needs to start from the top of the institution. You need to have a senior manager or inside of an institution, ideally at the level of the deputy vice chancellor or vice president or vice rector, depends how and what terminology you have inside of your institution. But it is really essential to have that, because they can bring in relevant stakeholder groups. But I can tell you even that it is not potentially just relevant to have that senior manager inside of an institution to do something that is relevant here. Just recently, I was asked to review a learning analytics initiative in an Australian university. While the project in the learning analytics group was started and sponsored by their deputy vice chancellor, the process was not really all that advanced. They had lots of problems because other relevant stakeholders were not part of that deputy vice chancellor's portfolio. IT was completely different. They were reporting to the chief operating officer. And they had a fairly kind of an extensive small war between their learning analytics team and their IT team. And equally so, their business intelligence team, who was responsible for all the learning and teaching data inside our institution, had a different culture. And they were basically, again, having a different difficulty to understand some of these issues. I'm going to return back to this example because there are many other interesting things that were happening, but they are also kind of nicely mapped into the policy framework. With respect to the students, we have plenty of these self-appointed advocates of students who are saying that students don't want to have their data collected. Our results are showing that students just require transparency. And students basically require high ethical and privacy protection standards. In particular, they require that they are very clearly communicated with some third parties are potentially going to get their data. For example, you have an external consultant who is going to provide analysis of students' data. In some cases as well, students are suggesting that they would like to get another level of informed consent for such use of data. So that's really one critical thing. Another critical thing is that students are not a homogeneous group. So there are cultural differences. So our results are showing, for example, that students in the UK and the Netherlands have the highest expectation in our sample in comparison, for example, to Estonian students and Spanish students. However, Spanish students by far had the highest expectations in terms of the services that can be provided to them based on learning analytics. There's another interesting thing that we found is that those students who are not paying any tuition fee, which is the case for all the home students and EU students in Scotland, versus those who are paying tuition fees have different expectations. Those who don't pay tuition fees, they have lower expectations in terms of the services. And it brings us also to something that is well established also in behavioral economics, and the effect that Dan Ariely developed, the zero price. That basically when you are paying a zero price, then you are applying social norms. But when you are paying even a cent for something, you start applying market norms. And that's a really very essential thing as well for us to consider when we are implementing learning analytics, especially many of our institutions are serving lots of international students. But then students also are not quite sure that teaching staff will have enough skills to use learning analytics effectively. And in all honesty, they agree with teaching staff. Teaching staff also don't think they have enough skills to use learning analytics effectively. That's really what we are also finding inside of our results. Whereas teaching staff are most concerned with is workload. Workload, workload, workload. But I think, anything that you try to change in higher education, you'll hear back from academics, workload, workload, workload. And that's quite true. I hardly know any academic who is not putting at least 60 to 70 hours a week. And depends on which country, but that's really something that is a norm. So our workload is indeed. I think part of the reason is that we are really doing a bad job in the way how we are communicating, the ways how analytics should be done, and what types of benefits can be offered to those who are at the forefront of teaching. Many of the comments that we got through focus groups and also open-ended survey questions were primarily referring to learning analytics by the fear of many academic staff thinking that they will be now all of a sudden responsible to collect data from all these pots of data across the campus. They will be then all of a sudden responsible to analyze all this data, and they will be eventually even held responsible to act on that data and the findings that they are getting from these data. And that's basically a bad message that we are sending in terms of analytics, because we are spending lots of time explaining what type of data are there, rather than thinking about how we can streamline some of these processes, and also thinking about what is that added value. And we are now getting to the point that there are some of the systems, such as, for example, the work that Abelardo Pardo is doing at the University of South Australia, leading the OnTask system for scalable, personalized feedback. That is making a clear difference, and it's being now evaluated in 6 or 7 different universities with a fairly consistent outcome. So that's really something that we need to do much better work on. There's another point where students and teaching staff agree on. There is no obligation to act based on analytics. We asked them that question in the surveys. And so that's basically the lowest scoring service-related question for students. And it is equally so for academic staff. And academic staff even suggest that would be kind of against students' agency. And students also agreed inside of the focus groups in terms of they don't want to basically kind of patronize, but at the same time they want to get some level of support. So we need to kind of play kind of nicely and softly in this very delicate space of respecting students' agency, but at the same time providing them with something which is a relevant feedback. We engaged experts as well into an exercise which is called group concept mapping. And this exercise of group concept mapping is something relatively similar to Delphi studies, except that we don't expect to have a consensus, but rather we asked them to generate certain statements. These statements were even crowdsourced, but then they were asked to rate them on the perceived ease of implementation and also based on the perceived importance. What they agreed on is that privacy and ethics are the most important but easy to implement. But equally so, they need to be addressed first. So you basically have to have a very clear, transparent process with respect to privacy and ethics, and then you are good to go. You basically need to follow this process. In terms of desired behavioral change, what do you want to do with learning analytics? Is that basically student retention? If you have a student retention problem, that's fine. Then you identify that as a kind of a critical behavioral change that has to happen in terms of analytics providing certain alerts. Or is it basically that you are thinking about the quality assurance or just quality improvement of your learning and teaching designs? Or is it that you also want to help your students to better plan their learning and set better goals as they are going throughout their studies? But this is also equally important that you need to think what are the implications for your primary stakeholders. We had a pilot at the University of Edinburgh in which we work with an external consultant. They are quite well known for their work on student on academic staff focusing approaches for learning analytics. And they also provided us with some of these things that are called a dashboard. A dashboard, the word I must say, my pet peeve, because everybody thinks that learning analytics equals to dashboard. And what we basically saw with those beautiful dashboards is that our academic staff couldn't really make any sense out of them. They were having these predictors that were saying that are identifying why some students are potentially at risk, but I had to bring in my students with background in machine learning to explain what that feature or predictor means, rather than it would be something for them fairly easily actionable. But equally so, what we are seeing, and why I'm suggesting the ways how we are doing these types of dashboards can be harmful. And we are seeing many studies. For example, there was a study at Michigan University reported in 2015 that found that students who were exposed to the use of some of these dashboards, comparing students with the class average, had a negative association with intrinsic student motivation over a summer course students were taking to catch up with some of their science courses. Equally so, a recent randomized controlled trial that was reported at the Learning at Scale conference last week in London, they had this dashboard which was basically built based on more than 30 years worth of data about students' grades, students' workload, and they were presented to the students. They randomized students in two conditions: those who were encouraged to use the dashboard and those who were just basically told there's a dashboard. Those who were encouraged to use the dashboard, they found that they had a lower GPA over the course of the use of this dashboard. So we need to be very careful when we are saying that we are going to implement this dashboard and what data we are going to show to our users. And equally so, we need to even think about this. There's a complexity here and tension as well. While we say our students need to have transparency about all their data, some of that data and some of that transparency can be harmful. And so we need to basically have a way how we need to dance this kind of interesting play of things that are done. And we also need to think about some of these inadvertent consequences of the use of learning analytics. There was a tool several years ago developed at one of the US-based colleges. My memory, I think it's Austin Payne College. And they developed this tool which is called Degree Compass. And they were basically trying to suggest the students that what is the ideal pathway for them to complete as they are going through the journeys. We never saw, consequently, like while they were reporting lots of improvement in terms of both student retention and the student grades in early days, they were not really ever responding to some of the criticisms that they also received. And that was basically that may steer students just to take easy courses that are easy to complete, rather than something that could be beneficial for their careers or for their overall development. And that's another potential thing that analytics can steer if you are just using some of these algorithms. And that's basically something that you need to consider very carefully as we are implementing learning analytics. What is that engagement strategy? How we are engaging relevant stakeholders and how this is happening. One of the critical things with respect is the alignment of learning analytics with wider institutional strategy. And that's not an easy process. I already mentioned the problem of an Australian university. Equally so, I had a similar experience when I was in Canada. Vice President Academic was funding learning and teaching innovation projects. We had one of those. We were actually developing some of these tools that were feeding back some of the information to students to promote better collaborative work. Everything worked well until the point we had to deploy that into the operational LMS of the institution. At that point, we basically collided with the existing strategy and the policies of the IT department, said, you can't do it. You can't have access to that data. And so it took more than 7 months to negotiate just to run that pilot. But then last year, I returned back to that same institution, and they were pretty much still dwelling on that same problem. So it's a basically critical thing. When you are developing a learning analytics policy, it needs to be equally aligned with some of your IT-related policies, student success policies, as well as learning and teaching policies. And there should be some level of coordination between these policies. There's another critical thing that many institutions are, and that's what we saw as well as we were going basically through all our stakeholder groups, is this kind of fear of potential, like, creating an impression of surveillance. Nobody wants to be surveilled. And students, in many cases, just want to have that clarity that certain data are being collected, and they're also clear in terms of that some of this data is also going to be humanely communicated back to them. Not all of a sudden that you communicate with them something that you are not supposed to do. But then equally so, while we are seeing that we can communicate some relevant messages to the students, there's something which is basically also communicated as a potential concern, but we also don't understand from the research, and then I think that's an important research topic for us to pursue, is what is that information overload? How frequently we communicate that information to students? What is the efficient way to also engage our academic staff with the use of some of this information? And the same applies to senior leaders. And then another critical thing is interventions. It's fine that you actually have some of these early warning alerts for your senior staff, but then it has resourcing implication. So if you expect that you have an early warning system that is basically implemented in some of your existing courses, subjects, or units, depends on the terminology you are using in your university, and you expect that your academic staff is also going now to take extra actions to act upon that information without consideration of the workload for the academic, then I think we are not really doing the right job. And then there is another critical thing as well, is in many cases, institutions are putting together external teams that are supporting students. Like, for example, one of the Australian universities I was with, they had a specially designed pilot project for 3 years that was funded by their provost to act upon this information and see the extent to which they can improve retention in that specific university. Sadly, in their case, when we applied some of the more rigorous information to study the effectiveness of that program, didn't work out. Didn't produce significant improvement in student retention. But it did improve student satisfaction. And it did improve student experience. So there are certain qualitative outputs that need to also be considered as part of the process. Capacity. Where we spend a lot of time, and there was also a study that I mentioned before with Shane Dawson and Leah McFadden in their case study reported in the Educational Technology and Society, is we spend a lot of time and primary persistence on technical details. Do we have a data lake? Who has access to data lake? How we can easily pour this data? Those are very important questions, but they need to be aligned with the pedagogical reasons why we are doing some of these things. In the study that I was mentioning from McFadden and Dawson, they were actually suggesting that inside of their institution, hardly anybody used learning management system for anything but basically timetabling, a little bit of content sharing, and in very rare instances, some of the level of communication. That was basically something that was also reflective of the pedagogies that was done inside of those institutions. Therefore, we equally need to think about these pedagogical implications when we are talking about the capacity of our institution, how we can move from these technical issues to other more pedagogical questions. But there's another thing, human capacity. And it's a really hard thing. The case study that I mentioned from Australia, I had a chance to review some time ago. They had a really good data science team, but they were only composed of the professional staff. And they felt completely disempowered to do anything inside their institution. Their perception was that academic staff, they can care less about anything. They don't want to do anything. And yet inside of that same institution, they even had several outstanding learning analytics academics who were keen to help, yet they were not incorporated inside of that process. Therefore, understanding that process is really critical, and also understanding what type of talent. But that talent needs to involve not only professional, but also academic staff that is promoting learning analytics. Simon Buckingham and Tim McKay last month published a paper in EDUCAUSE as well about different innovation models that are used across different institutions. One of them is digital education innovation greenhouse at the University of Michigan, where they have, in addition to the business lead of the group academic lead, in addition to that academic lead, they had 7 academic champions for any of the change. If you don't have those academic champions, your change, if it's coming only from professional groups, won't easily happen. There's another critical thing is, and we already touched on that, how we are using data. In many cases as well, when academics see some of the dashboards, they see inconsistencies in those data. So we don't have enough really reliability in the ways how we are processing some of the data that are being communicated to some of the stakeholders. We are also clearly not using these data for our decision making. And the question is how we can change that culture. In many cases needs to be kind of pondered upon. When I was with the University of Edinburgh, I was very privileged to be in an institution who had a vice chancellor with a background in machine learning and digital education. So making and insisting that decisions are made based on data was an easy case. And the institution had that person in charge for 16 years. But in many other cases, people are fairly skeptical also, as Rebecca Ferguson et al. In their Journal of Learning Analytics paper in 2015 are suggesting skeptical of the findings of other disciplines. For example, if I'm getting data and data are coming from engineering, don't go to social sciences. Don't go to social sciences because you need to. But they are also to a certain extent quite right in that process because they are using different pedagogical models and they are approaching these type of things differently. Final area, and that's basically where we had the most of the weaknesses in the overall state of the art and state of practice. It's very few examples how learning analytics is effectively measured. What we are getting in most of the cases, these kind of needs to be very clear in terms of both qualitative and quantitative indicators. I mentioned the case of the learning analytics retention approach that was used, and they didn't fix the retention problem. However, they also identified some of these unintended consequences. The question is it worthwhile doing it or not? I think that question becomes also kind of a cultural and political environmental thing to be done. When I was in Scotland, that was highly appreciated because they had this process of quality enhancement inside the country, but in some other cases may not be. But then has to be also taken contextually as well. That institution already had retention ratio which was close to 85%. So maybe retention was really hard sell to be made in the first place. In some other cases where retention is much lower, in the low 50s or even low 40s, that's probably where you have much more opportunities to do something with side of these processes. And equally so, when you are measuring the effects of learning analytics, you need to seek that feedback. And I can tell you, you can get lots of feedback from students. When we were doing these things with students and surveys, we would always manage to get our targets based on the sampling methods that we wanted to get. However, academic stuff, no way. Not only institutions don't have the approaches to rapidly and systematically survey academic stuff, but also they are fairly reluctant to even complete the surveys. They were even finding the kind of reasons to challenge why the surveys was invalid in the first place to be administered. And then very few, we managed to get many more of them through basically going through the learning and teaching committees across the universities. So that's what we did. I spent the whole winter semester in 2017 in Edinburgh going through learning and teaching committees across the campus. And that way I managed to reach out to about 500 or 600 different academic staff about communicating learning analytics and also the policy work that we were doing in the area of learning analytics. And then what we were doing in that process, we were collecting all their feedback. And they were, as you know, academics are pretty critical and love to actually speak about some of the issues. So in many cases, that was what was done most effectively. But then final thing and final point in terms of evaluating the effects of learning analytics. What is really hard is to isolate the effect of learning analytics. You are doing so many things on your campuses. You have this new adaptive learning system. You have this new student success team. You have this other advisory team that you have on your campus. You have the learning analytics. Which of them is helping your students the most? Or how can you isolate this effect? And should we be even bothered to isolate this small effect and rather think how the kind of best strategies would be to combine some of these things? I always return back to a small anecdote of a colleague in Canada who had a problem with his sick child for almost 7 or 8 years. And that basically was a kind of, initially started as a kind of a health-related problem, mostly like physical, but eventually also started becoming a fairly strong mental problem as well. And they tried many things, many doctors, and they were doing all these different types of cocktails. And then eventually they discovered that they need to add extra other type of pill, and problem solved. And then when my colleague asked the doctor, should I basically now cut all these other things that they were using, the doctor said, no, don't touch anything. This is now working. So I'm not saying that we as scientists should not be trying to isolate some of these effects, but what I'm trying to say is that we cannot think about analytics as a singular thing that is happening inside of our institutions, but rather it has to be considered as a part of a bigger system. And I think that's the key message. In terms of the epilogue or some of the examples, what we did based on this Sheila framework is the policy that we developed at the University of Edinburgh. And how we decided to do this policy was that rather than engage all the stakeholders with a kind of a document which would use all this kind of dry legal language, informed consent and other things, we decided to have a 2-pager. And that 2-pager would basically be just defining principles and purposes of learning analytics. And then we use that process to engage the entire university community. That was my excuse to go to all these learning and teaching committees across the campus, to engage our student association, and also to engage all other relevant professional groups as we were going. Some of these critical principles, we recognize that data will always be incomplete, and no major decisions about students can be made algorithmically. There should be a human in the loop. You can't say to the student, you should go from the campus by just basically sending an automatic email that was based on a simple algorithm. Or obvious things like transparency of the use of learning analytics that is also governing the ways how informed consent is implemented. But equally so, good governance of learning analytics should happen. And as a consequence of this principle, the university developed the Learning Analytics Review Group, who is now responsible for reviewing all the new projects, initiatives, and anything that is related to learning analytics on campus. There's another critical thing is that as Edinburgh was not really just to support one group of students, we explicitly indicated that deficit models should not be the primary purpose, but rather we should unlock the potential of all the students across the board. And then we also recognize inside of our policy that algorithms can perpetuate bias. Mikola Pechenicki at the University of Eindhoven in the Netherlands ran a study in 2015, and basically he was trying to simulate what would happen if he would use a predictive algorithm to enroll students into an IT school. What we know is what would be a good predictor for that? Gender, unfortunately. We know that we have a huge shortage of women inside of our IT programs. And so, unfortunately, then gender would also pop up as the significant predictor in these algorithms. He simulated if the decision process was delegated purely to the algorithm, that over the course of years we would have even fewer women inside of our IT programs because their gender would be a risk factor. And therefore algorithms can perpetuate that bias, and we need to recognize it and take measures that are suggesting something else. In addition to that, we also recognize in terms of the pushback and many other things, and also through consultations with the relevant unions, that academic staff performance would not be monitored based on learning analytics. And quite honestly, I don't know how would I do it, because there are so many different pedagogical models that can result in so many different behavioral patterns of both students and teaching staff. Therefore, you cannot just simply say log in 55 times into your LMS every week for an academic staff and submit 15 different messages. I know that such things are already happening in some universities when they are trying to implement some of these pedagogies, but it's not a good thing. And we explicitly incorporate this as a principle in our policy. In terms of the purposes of learning analytics, what we did is basically we suggested that quality would be the first thing, and improvement of quality of learning designs was really the primary purpose when we spelled it out. Equality for our students and equity across campus, that to use analytics to evaluate existing measures and approaches to eliminate biases that are available inside of the university. Personalized feedback, especially now that the university is trying to scale up its online presence, was highly recognized, and particularly to cope with scale. And then thinking about skills, university is now having this, the university is in the city of Edinburgh, and city of Edinburgh basically got a city deal, which basically resulted in a deal with the government worth about £1 billion. And that meant also that the strategic objective of that deal was for Edinburgh to become the capital of Europe in data science. And therefore, you need to incorporate, and university is very busy across the campus to very much educate everybody, even carpenters around the city, to be good at data science. This whole process of the policy development was recently blogged by a colleague of mine, though we are writing an experience report as well for one of the journals, so stay tuned, and I'm going to communicate that shortly. So for those who are interested, just kind of see some of that journey, they are welcome to do that. Few final remarks, really nothing new that I didn't already say, but anyways, just to reiterate points. Complexity is something that is driving our institutions. Learning analytics or policy of any technology innovation implementation is, yeah, it is a wicked problem. But it's basically because we have this intrinsic complexity inside of our institutions that is driving lots of the things that we could or could not do. And it is also important to recognize the role of leadership. We cannot simply assume that technology is a silver bullet which will solve all our problems if you don't have strong leadership and strong institutional capacity to implement learning analytics. And equally so, we need to really work hard on the development of the culture of data-informed decision-making. We are not good at that. And thanks so much for your attention.